Hey, what's up folks, how's it going? This is Waj. Hope you guys are all doing well. And today we're going to be taking a look at the new Microsoft Surface Pro X tablet and comparing it directly against the iPad Pro 12.9 inch version. Now the iPad Pro came out last year, but it's still super relevant. Both tablets are very sleek in terms of design, have amazing built-in displays and fairly powerful internal specifications. And with the respective keyboard attachments as well as stylus/pen configuration, they ultimately want to replace the old laptop they have lying around. We're going to see how they fare up against each other, see how they kind of compare in terms of overall performance, versatility, form factor, design, all those fun things. So if you're interested in getting the ultimate tablet right now in 2019, going into 2020, we're going to see how they do against each other and which one is best overall. Let's get right into it. Now, in terms of the price perspective, both tablets are pretty much exactly the same in terms of starting price, both around $999, just under $1,000. The Surface Pro X all come with the SQ1 processor that's co-engineered by Qualcomm and Microsoft. That's an 8-core chip that can turbo up to 3 GHz. We also have an integrated Adreno 685 GPU, as well as 8 GB on the stock configuration with an upgrade option of 16 GB of DDR4 memory. Now, the iPad Pro is using the A12X processor. That's also an octa-core, but we have a little bit less memory configuration on the stock configuration. So you're looking at 64 GB of internal memory versus the Surface Pro X has 128 GB, and we have slightly less RAM at 4 GB. Now, if you do upgrade to the 1 TB option for the iPad Pro, you also get a little bit more RAM memory, up to 6 GB. Now, the display size from a diagonal perspective is actually quite similar, 12.9 inch versus 13 inch on the Surface Pro X, but there are different aspect ratio. The iPad Pro uses a 4:3 aspect ratio versus you're looking at a 3:2 aspect ratio on the Surface Pro X, and that's why you're going to see that the general shape of both devices are a little bit different. If you're looking at the landscape mode, you're going to see that the Surface Pro X is a little bit longer and not as tall as the iPad Pro, but when we're taking a look at the overall thickness and weight of both devices, the iPad Pro wins on that front. It's only measuring around 5.9 millimeters in terms of thickness and much lighter at 631 grams versus the Surface Pro X is 7.3 millimeters in terms of thickness and about 776 grams in terms of weight. Now, both devices are actually made of similar build materials, aluminum mostly. Now, due to the fact that the iPad Pro is so thin, it is a little bit vulnerable to bending at times, and in extreme situations, you can find yourself bending the entire display. There's tons of videos on YouTube that demonstrate that quite well. I'm not going to do it here. Now, the Surface Pro X seems a little bit more resilient and a little bit more rigid due to the fact that it is a little bit thicker, and just the overall construction feels a little bit more solid than the ultra thin, ultra portable design that we have on the iPad Pro. Now, on the finishes themselves, the Surface Pro X uses this iodized matte black finish, which looks really sleek and stylish, but it is a total fingerprint magnet, unlike the similar matte finish that we have on the iPad Pro, but the color is a little bit different. It's more of a metallic-y gray color, and it's definitely more resilient to fingerprints. Plus, you have an oleophobic coating on the front of the display, which definitely makes it a little bit more resilient to fingerprints, and it's certainly a little bit better in terms of general upkeep to make the thing look a little bit cleaner at all times. Now, probably one of the biggest reasons why Microsoft wanted to make the Surface Pro X is to kind of modernize the design of their very popular Surface Pro lineup of tablets that they've been putting out for several years. In fact, the Surface Pro 7 looks pretty much identical to the past few generations of Surface tablets, and this is where the Surface Pro X really departs from that design, making the bezels ultra thin and the overall kind of form factor a little bit more modernized. We also have a more modernized kind of approach to ports and connectivity options. We don't have a headphone jack, unfortunately, much like the iPad Pro, and we're using USB-C primarily for all of the physical connection interface. There are no USB-A connection for legacy support that you'll find on the new Surface Pro 7. Now, another key feature is that we have a nano SIM slot for LTE support. That's something that you don't find on the Surface Pro 7. Now, there are versions of the iPad Pro that support LTE, but certainly not in the stock configuration. Furthermore, just like the iPad Pro, there is no micro SD expansion slot, which is unfortunate. That's something that you do find, however, on the standard Surface Pro 7 tablet. And much like removing the headphone jack, it looks like Microsoft is really taking a page out of Apple's book in order to minimize the amount of port and connectivity options in order to streamline their product. But ultimately, for me as an end user, it's more of a lack of feature and a lack of versatility compared to what is available in other laptop replacement tablets, including the Surface Pro 7. Furthermore, the type cover and Surface Pen is completely different on the Surface Pro X. It's separate from what you're going to find with the Surface lineup of tablets. So the actual type cover is very similar in terms of overall design compared to the standard Surface tablets. Exactly the same keyboard configuration. You have a trackpad as well as an Alcantara finish that feels super nice and comfortable to type on. It's a much better typing experience than the smart keyboard attachment that we find on the iPad Pro. Just in terms of general spacing and overall comfort is better due to the fact that you actually have a nice palm rest that accompanies the keyboard, much like you would find on a traditional laptop. Now, what's interesting over here is that the new Surface Pro X Pen is actually integrated inside the type cover itself and actually charges through the type cover. Now, the functionality and overall performance of the Surface Pen is exactly the same as you would find from the previous generation Surface Pen, so it has the same level of pressure sensitivity, super accurate way to interface with the touchscreen display, and the overall Pixel Sense technology that we have built into the Microsoft display is phenomenal. It does a great job of projecting your palm, so if you're going to doodle, take notes on the screen, or just use the pen itself to control your Windows interface, it's truly an uncompromising experience. Now let's talk about the displays on both platforms, which are fantastic in both regards. Now the resolution is slightly higher on the Microsoft Surface Pro X, about 2880 by 1920 with the PPI count about 267 PPI versus the Liquid Crystal Retina display on the iPad Pro is 2732 by 2048 with the PPI count of about 264. A very minor resolution difference. Now there is a pretty big difference in terms of overall display quality and brightness. The iPad Pro has one of the best displays on any consumer electronic device, even though it's now more than a year old. It has 120 hertz maximum refresh rate versus 60 hertz on the Microsoft side, and it's also a lot brighter, rated up to 600 nits versus 450 nits. So if you're going to take the iPad Pro outside, it's super bright. You won't find too many issues with using the Surface Pro X outdoor, but you can definitely notice the brightness and the overall luminosity and vibrancy on the iPad display is just stunning. From a resolution and sharpness perspective, as we mentioned before, it's very minor difference. You're probably not going to notice anything whatsoever between the two in terms of general sharpness. Color rendition and overall accuracy, I do have to give to the iPad Pro. It just looks stunning in real life. Haven't really encountered a tablet display as good as the iPad, again, even though it's a year old. Now, the internal speakers on the iPad Pro are also superior. Not only do you have more speakers, it has a quad speaker configuration, pretty much a speaker in every corner, but the dynamic range is better than the dual stereo speakers that we have on the Microsoft Surface Pro, even though they're tuned by Dolby Digital Premium. And the microphone is also a triple configuration on the iPad versus dual near-field microphones on the Surface Pro X. Now, both have custom SoCs specifically designed for their tablet architecture. So Microsoft has co-engineered the SQ1 chip with Qualcomm to specifically make the Surface Pro X tablet. And it's the same thing with the Apple A12X architecture, which is their fastest 8-core CPU that they have made to date, specifically designed for the iPad Pro platform. Now, in terms of actual performance, the A12X is an absolute monster. Based on our experience, it's actually faster than the baseline version of the MacBook Air, and even rivals the performance of some fairly moderately powered laptop, including the entry-level MacBook Pros. And compared to the SQ1 chip that's in the Surface Pro X, if you take a look at our Geekbench score, which is really the only cross-compatible benchmarking suite that we can use to compare these two, you're seeing a pretty decent difference, both on the single-core and indeed on the multi-core performance, even though both CPUs have 8 physical cores. So on the single core performance, you're looking at over 1,100 points on the iPad side versus about 729 points on the Surface Pro X, and about 4,700 points on the multi-core score versus 2,800 points on the Surface Pro X. Now, for the question of replacing your physical laptop, both tablets are certainly adequate for most of your day-to-day needs in terms of surfing the web, doing some Microsoft Office related tasks, and you can certainly do some multimedia-based applications on the Surface Pro X, such as photo editing and even some basic video editing. But when it comes to doing anything specifically related to multimedia creation and things like that, you're going to be limited on both platforms, but for different reasons. On the Surface Pro X side, since we're using an ARM-based processor, some applications just are not compatible with that specific architecture and will not run, even though the system is being run on the full Windows 10 operating system, and indeed the SQ1 Qualcomm chip is just not as fast as what you're going to find with a moderately powered i7 or i5 processor from Intel, or the equivalent AMD mobile chip. And on the iPad Pro, it's a little bit tricky because the Apple A12 processor is more than powerful enough to do most of your video, photo, and multimedia editing needs, specifically on iMovie, iPhoto, and the Apple suite of software that's available, as well as some third-party software. But due to the fact that it's still not running a full desktop-based application suite like the Adobe Premiere suite and things like that, you're still going to be limited, and iPad OS is becoming more and more like a full-fledged operating system with better file management. You can even hook up a mouse and have a cursor movement and everything like that. But at this stage of the game, it's still not as versatile and as full-fledged as what you would find with a MacBook Pro and indeed a powerful Windows-based laptop. Now moving on, both of these two have rear and front-facing cameras. In terms of the front-facing side, we have 5 megapixel front-facing on the Microsoft tablet versus 7 megapixels on the Apple tablet, and both actually have a face unlock system. So if you want to use that, you can utilize that on both platforms. The rear cameras are a little bit different. We have 12 megapixels on the iPad versus 10 megapixels on the Surface Pro X. Both can do 4K video at 30 FPS as well as 1080p. The iPad can also do a little slow motion at 240 frames per second, 720p, and 120 frames per second at 1080p. So the rear-facing camera, from a quality perspective and from a sheer versatility perspective, is superior on the iPad Pro side, based on my experience. Now, lastly, let's talk about the battery performance. From a capacity standpoint, we have a 40 watt-hour battery on the Surface Pro X versus 36.7 watt-hour battery on the iPad Pro. Now, according to the manufacturers, Apple claims about 10 hours of wireless web or video playback and about 13 hours on the Microsoft side in that typical use case scenario. Now, we like to do a video playback test in order to keep the battery drain test as simple as possible and to basically simulate the experience of watching a TV show or TV series or a couple of movies on a long plane journey or something like that. So on airplane mode, 50% screen brightness, we got a total runtime about 12 hours and 4 minutes on the Surface Pro X versus in the exact same scenario, we got 12 hours and 51 minutes on the iPad Pro. Now, of course, in terms of general use, it's going to depend upon your specific tasks, your usage profile, and things like that. But I bet that you're probably going to get some decent battery performance out of both of them. But on average, I bet you're probably going to get a slightly better on the iPad Pro. That's certainly the case that I have experienced thus far. Now, to sum up everything we've talked about, from a pure versatility standpoint, certainly the Surface Pro X has a slight advantage in the fact that it is running the full Windows operating system. Granted, there are some limitations with the ARM-based CPU that we have inside. You might run into some compatibility issues with your particular software. In that instance, you probably want to check what software you're using on a day-to-day basis and see if it supports ARM-based hardware. If not, then go with the Surface Pro 7 in that regard. And the iPad Pro, from a pure hardware perspective, is definitely the superior device. I think the display is nicer. The internal specifications from that A12X standpoint is definitely the faster CPU. You're definitely going to get better graphical performance as well. Not to mention, from a pure creative standpoint, there's so many great applications on the iOS platform that's specifically optimized for the iPad Pro. If you're into drawing or any of that creative kind of stuff, there's many things that the new Apple iPad OS offers that makes it more of a full-on laptop based PC than anything else. And coupled with the keyboard attachments, it is definitely a feasible laptop replacement device that will get you slightly better battery performance as well. But besides those general things, guys, that's really it. Now, we will also have a direct comparison between the Surface Pro X and the Microsoft Surface Pro 7, which is their latest and current Surface Pro lineup of tablets. And that will clarify the real differences between the Surface Pro X and the standard Surface Pro 7. If you're interested in that, definitely check that out on the card or click in the description down below for more details. Also, check out the description down below for more product links and information. And if you're interested in getting any of these tablets, go through our affiliate Amazon links. Helps us make videos like this possible. So thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you later. Take care.